Shelly Miscavige. She has not appeared in public since 2005.
Where's Shelley and what happened?
Where is Shelley?
We're looking at like 17 years of a person just missing.
Shelly Miscavige was given into the sole care of L. Ron Hubbard by her parents when she was 12.
This is where Shelley is believed to be being held captive.
Do you believe that Shelly Miscavige is a threat today?
Oh,
Absolutely.
she's seen it all. She's been by his side the whole time.
Welcome back to the channel. I'm your host for today, Claire Headley, and this is my next episode in my series of Where is Shelly Miscavige, in which I have been delving deep into the life of Shelley, learning so much about her along the way by speaking with those who knew and worked with her personally. For today, this is part 2 with my dear friend and my special guest for today, Karen Schless Pressley. Hello, Karen.
Hey, Claire, it's good to be back with you now for our part 2.
Yes, amazing. We had such amazing feedback from part 1. Your stories are just incredible. I really appreciate you taking the time to do this with me and engaging in this path I've set out for myself of learning everything about Shelly Miscavige that we possibly can.
Yeah, you created an amazing path, and I find it just incredible the number of people that have gone on this path with you. The number of comments and viewers from our part 1. I'm really humbled by those comments and really appreciate people's in-depth comments, talking about how we discussed, just looking for people's humanity and discussing the real personal side of Sea Org life that is kind of hard to talk about. So I think you've created an amazing path that a lot of people are on.
Well, thank you for being here with me. I really appreciate it. And yes, amazing, amazing feedback. Then this is growing into an amazing community as well. So supportive and just a really good thing. But so for today, we're going to pick up on part 2 of your interactions with Shelley. Where would you like to resume for this?
Well, we were discussing a story about how Shelley, as I was doing my liability formula after walking off my IMPR post and being punished hauling rocks in the levee for a couple of weeks, and how I reached out to Shelley to ask her if I could do anything to help her as part of my liability formula. And she said, yes, drop what you're doing and fly out to the Flag Land Base. So I told the story of coming out to the FLB and having an office down the hall. Dave and Shelley were at one end of the WB and I was at the other. And what it was like to just be there with them, working, just, doing a design, submitting it down the hall and getting it approved. I was so used to the command channels at the base and following everything. And now here we were fast tracking this project.
Yeah. And sorry, just to interject for a minute. So command channels in Scientology obviously refers to that everything has to run through every executive above you in the chain of command, so to speak. So previously, I imagine that when you were the int management public relations person or officer, I should say, that if you wanted to get something approved, it would have to go through Guillaume Leserve as executive director international, and then CMO, which is the next management organization above that. And then somebody like probably 6 to 7 people would have to sign off on it before it ever made it to David Miscavige, who of course had to sign off on everything, right?
Yeah. And the joke was, the bureaucracy was so ridiculous, but the joke was none of the people that signed off of it had any knowledge or had anything to do with what I was doing. And very few people ever bothered to ask me questions about it or anything. They just signed off and it went to Dave straightway. So he was the one that would catch the errors or the things that need to be corrected. And maybe Claire, you mentioned to me that there was a point when when you were in RTC, and you were doing some cramming.
Yes.
And maybe that's what happened, because I don't remember this exactly, but I remember going into a cramming cycle with you. I don't remember what it was about, but it had to do with Dave getting a submission from me, and maybe something on it needed to be corrected. Do you remember that?
Yes, I do. So this was, and again, so for context and, you know, scenery of what we're talking about. So I was in Religious Technology Center, and I was specifically at this time. So from, let's see, 1996 until 2000, I was in the section of Religious Technology Center that was responsible for overseeing management operations. And so we would attend every single meeting that David Miscavige had with management, which, as you recall, were extensive, especially when he was on that property. But even when he was in Clearwater, Florida, he would do conference calls. Like every, we had those spaceship conference phones set up so that it was perfect audio quality and all this. Anyway, but yeah, so my role specifically was cramming, which cramming in Scientology is essentially correction. So if a management executive does a proposal and it's deemed that it's either violates Hubbard policy or directives or isn't in compliance with David Miscavige's instructions, then the purpose of cramming is to then address that. So either find out what you disagree with, for example, or find out what you did wrong, or clear up your misunderstood words that you didn't understand that are causing you to do it incorrectly, whatever. And so, yes, I worked in the Qual building in that little hallway where there were cramming offices.
I remember that.
Yeah. And I had the one all the way at the end. They had the camera system, of course. And I don't remember what our specific interaction was, but I'm quite positive that it had to do with a submission or a proposal that you had done that had been rejected by David Miscavige. And Shelly Miscavige is the person that told me to do this with you. And there were always there was always a tone associated with such a situation. Like, for example, if most often if it was Mark Ingber, let's say, it was deemed that, oh, he messed up because he has evil purposes and he's committed crimes, and get to the bottom of it. In the case with you, it was different. It was like, Shelley was protective of you, and I think she could see that you had talents that could serve the purposes of what Shelley deemed to be good for Scientology. And so it was just a different tone. That's what I remember. But I think it was not that long before you ended up escaping, if I remember correctly.
Well, I left in the end of the summer of 1998. And I think we all got back from Flag after the whole big Flag land base project. I remember that being, Lisa McPherson, I think, died in 95 or 96.
Yep, December 1995.
Okay, so I was there for months, many months after that. So I think I got back to the base in the middle of 96 or the end of 96. So, but at that point, we were talking about Shelley. I had been talking about her as who she was as COB assistant, who she was as her own person, and who she was as my advocate. And so that's how I got into that storytelling, that she really became my advocate the day that she told me, come to the Flagland base. I think ever since, and that was in 95, and I didn't leave until 98. So she was my advocate over from 1995 to 1998.
Wow.
And I wish that I could have talked to her about the fears and the agony that I felt about the way Scientology was going. And in some cases, I did try. In fact, maybe this is a good time to read a story that is in my book that relates to this.
Okay.
Because Shelley, I felt that she was my advocate. And this was always a conflict in the sense of, you and I discussed the theme or the motif of RTC was being as hard as cold chrome steel. And I want to talk about that a couple of times in our talk today. In fact, I'm going to ask you a question about that in a little bit.
Okay.
But going back to this point, it was always a conflict because I felt that Shelley had to carry out her role as COB assistant, the hard as cold chrome steel bullshit that, First of all, did LRH write that, or was that by David Miscavige?
That was written by Hubbard.
Okay.
Yep.
All right. So since it was LRH, she adhered to it, as I'm sure you all were drilled and trained to do, and that's part of what I want to know. But anyway, her hard as cold chrome steel thing, she had to carry out that persona whenever she went around the base with Dave. But there were moments when she was not with Dave, and I felt like she would try to steal moments when she was just being her own person. And so I want to read something. This is my book, Escaping Scientology. I have a few pages tab that I want to read from today.
Perfect. Yep. And of course I will link to your book again in part 2 description for this video. So
I really appreciate that. Thank you.
Yeah, of course.
So this one moment when Shelley, I think, was just being her own person, she called me up to the villas. Now, you described that there were 3 villas. The lower villa was where Dave and Shelley lived.
Yes.
The middle villa, I understand, was where the RTC staff basically worked. And the upper villa had the war room and COB's office.
Yes, that's right.
Okay. Now, where was Shelley's office in those 3 buildings?
It was, so Shelley's office was also in the upper villa.
Okay, that's what I thought, because whenever I would go up to COB to do a design submission, or he would call me up to review something, I recall very specifically that Shelley had a desk that was kind of built into the wall, and it seemed like there was a big window above her desk.
Yep, that's exactly right.
Okay. And was it kind of a 3-sided window? I forgot what they're called. Anyway, she had was that the extent of her office?
Yes.
So very interesting. This is one of the questions I was going to ask you, but so COB had this big room that was his office. And when I would go up there, I trained myself to just make eye contact with him and not let my eyes gaze around his room. But when he would look away, or if he would step away from his desk, I looked around his room and I absorbed what was in there.
Mm-hmm.
And I noticed everything on top of his desk. He had a cup of Mont Blanc pens, which were $150 a piece, by the way. And I one time counted them. There was a dozen
Yes.
of these pens in the cup. And his chair was built to the size of his body, or it was custom sized for his small stature, as was his desk. It was at the scale that was not overwhelming to his body size, which was small. And he had an incredible sound system, speakers and everything else in there on shelves, and beautiful couch and all that. And I thought how interesting it was that COB assistant's office was basically off the hallway at the end of the room,
Mm-hmm.
under the window. Did she have more of an office than that?
Nope, that was her office there. When the RTC building was built, which I think that was after
I left.
Yeah, and that was a $40 million I think 40,000 square foot building.
Yeah.
And so she did have a bigger office in that building, but nonetheless, it was always diminutive, or, much smaller than, of course, David Miscavige, because as his assistant, she was his facility differential, is what it's referred to as in Hubbard policy, of she exists solely and only to get his orders carried out and executed.
Right. Well, so since we're talking about the office, I hope I can find this particular story. But one day, Shelley called me up to the upper villa, and because she said Dave wanted to go, COB wanted to go over a design submission with me. So when I walked in, she escorted me. It was past her desk, and there was like an island in the middle of the room. And she had placed my design submission on that island. And I did design submissions in these big, like 24 by 36 design books with spiral at the top, so we could flip the pages. And he would flip the pages and we would go through and all that. So this one particular time, she escorted me in there, and Dave came over, and she went and sat at her desk with her back to us, but obviously she could hear everything we were discussing. And COB stood on one side of the island looking at the pages, and I stood on the other. And as we were going through this, I don't remember which submission it was, but it had to do with, it was a Sea Org unit. And we were in the process of revising, like taking out the military look of the Sea Org. Even the insignia, we were looking at redesigning the insignia. And we were, even though it was military, we were finding different ways of representing the insignia besides military style, like bars on the shoulders and stuff like that. There's other ways we were discussing of how to do that. Shelley had a lot of ideas. And anyway, so this particular submission, Dave is looking at these pages, and here we are talking about the depths of Sea Org and Sea Org imagery, right? And as we're looking at this, hopefully, let me find this page. I had it marked. He's looking over at this Sea Org imagery, and he said, I wrote this in my book. Right now, I guess I didn't mark it. But he was looking at this Sea Org imagery, and he said he had his hands behind his back, like he was looking up, and he kind of went off into this deep in thought space that I had never seen him do before, because he was always riveted, right? Riveted, and those cold blue eyes would stare at you and make deep contact with you with his version of TRs. But but at this moment, he it's like he took a mental break or something, and he's standing there kind of gazing up in thought, and he said, we can't, and he said this out loud to me, where was my recorder when I needed it? And he said, and this is in my book, he said, we can't sell people Scientology, but we sure can sell them IAS memberships and donations.
Wow.
This is the leader of Scientology stating that we can't sell people Scientology.
Wow.
And where was my recorder?
Right, exactly. And isn't it true? I'd have to pull it out again, but I recall that Hubbard specifically had policy not to do fundraising, which is exactly what the IAS is and what the Ideal Org program is. And yet it's a direct violation of an existing policy. So if you're going to go to bat for Scientology and Hubbard, then don't ignore the violations right in front of your face, right?
Well, he's off on this thought, and he's thinking, well, we got to bring in money somehow. But what shocked me is that he would make that statement to me.
Right.
Me. I wasn't, Mark Yeager. I wasn't Guillaume Lesèvre. I wasn't Norman Starkey. I wasn't Shelly Miscavige. I was Seor Gimmich, and I thought, wow. But it made me realize, perhaps, who he felt me to be at that moment. Did he feel so comfortable that he could make such a statement with me? And at that moment, I looked over because Shelley was right down the hall, and she didn't flinch. She didn't move. Evidently, they had conversations about that all the time. So maybe that was no big deal as a topic. But for me, it absolutely lambasted me. And I write about this in my book because what shocked me is that Dave said, we can't sell people Scientology. And little things like this that I'm going to continue telling you stories about. These are the things that contributed to me knowing that I had to get out of the Sea Org and Scientology. Because if we can't sell people Scientology, then what the hell am I devoting my life to?
Right.
It certainly isn't to raising money for the IAS.
Right.
And I thought it was all about the tech and everything that we were doing. So, wow. So, that was a real bust. And
yeah, completely. And by the way, you reminded me of something that you may or may not be aware of, but in 1997, there was ongoing legal proceedings in which, and again, I, of course, even being in Religious Technology Center, I was not privy to what was being said or, any details. However, the piece that I was aware of is that the whole paramilitary terminology in relation to the Sea Organization, which of course, yes, it is a paramilitary organization, but everything about how the Sea Organization existed and was perceived led one to accurately come to the conclusion that David Miscavige is the head of the Sea Organization. And it strikes me that this was very probably a huge reason for this whole uniform redesign that you were working on, because obviously if everybody is wearing the same clothes and the same bars and the same everything, then yes, of course, even by the clothing that you're wearing, you would assume that David Miscavige is the head guy.
God, that just utterly blows me away because I had no idea you were going to say that. Or tell me that. And this is a notebook that it says Karen Schless on it, which I haven't been that since a long time ago. But this is the notebook that I brought with me to a couple of my meetings with Shelley to talk about uniforms. And I have notes in here from her of telling me how to get RTC and other units out of the military look.
There you go.
And that just blows me away that you knew that. That's incredible.
I didn't know we were going to talk about this either. It just struck me when you were talking because
wow.
Even like, we were talking about how I had to do correction actions with management. And one of those correction actions with management executives and also the marketing and dissemination staff was to change the way that they talked about David Miscavige, to not talk about him as the head guy. And even at the time, honestly, I was like, I don't understand why he is the head guy. Why would we, but I just did what I was told.
Right. Right. You didn't get to ask for what's the backup information about this, right?
No.
Oh my God. Okay. Well, okay. I'm going to read. I've got a couple things that tie into what we're talking about here.
Okay, perfect.
And this is from my book. So excuse me I'll be looking down reading. Okay.
You're good.
Okay. So let's see. So this is on page 283 of my book, And my chapter here is called Breaking Point. And I give anecdotes. I tell stories about all the little things that added up, like pennies dropping, of what caused me to realize I had to leave. Not only because, I really felt at that point that I had to be concerned about my survival because of what I saw, things going on at the base. All right, so bottom of page 283. I reflected on a recent conversation with Shelly Miscavige and I had, sitting in one of the Upper Villa offices. She had been reminiscing about being a Commodore's messenger on the Apollo when they wore uniforms of shorts and white boots and tie-ties. She and I laughed about me having no idea what a tie-tie was. And I'll just say, she said, I want you to come up with something. I just love that we wore these things called tie-ties. And I said, sir, what's a tie-tie? And she said, a tie-tie. And I laughed because she could not find words to describe a tie-tie. And what struck me is that I realized I didn't know how much education she had, but I knew that she didn't have much otherworldly experience. Like, she had been on the Apollo, the ship, the whole time she was a little girl, and grew up. I don't know how old she was when she got to the Flag Land Base or wherever she went. No, she married Dave. I don't know where they were. He had been out at the W shooting with LRH. I don't know how old they were when they got married, but she had no otherworldly experience.
Right.
Okay, so that was the context that I received this in. I had some education, college education, and I had a career several careers, music, design. And I thought, wow, her context, like, she couldn't describe it because she didn't have real life world experience to describe it.
Yep.
Anyway,
completely.
So we laughed about the fact that she had trouble describing a tie-tie other than calling it, a tie-tie. She had also told me about a movie that she had recently seen called The English Patient that I had seen once. A French-Canadian nurse was living in a bombed-out Italian monastery after World War II, nursing a critically burned English-speaking man who reveals his past working in the 1930s as a cartographer in the Egyptian-Libyan deserts. Shelly Miscavige was smitten with the styling of this film, The English Patient. She loved it so much, the clothing the actors wore from that period. She told me to research that movie and propose a uniform for COB's office staff based on the clothing, the costumes of the English Patient.
Wow.
It had a Banana Republic influence with 1930s khaki pants and white cotton shirts. So for that reason, I had to go watch The English Patient. I had seen it once before, but now she wanted me to use this as there was a reference that we used at the Int Base called Art Series 8, which was part of LRH's art series on teachings of art. And Art Series 8 was, you find something out in the world that's an example, and you use that as an example for your plan.
Right.
So my Art Series 8 was The English Patient, and this is for COB's office uniform. So what we're talking about there is 1930s, 1940s, if you remember, kind of high-waisted, pleated, sort of baggy pants that taper down to cuffs. And they're pleated, khaki color, gabardine, with white cotton shirts that had pockets, breast pockets, and collars, and sometimes without collars, but they had spread collars. And COB assistant told me, and this is a note in my notebook, and that she said, maybe you could add an ascot because LRH wore ascots. and it would look kind of sourcey. And that's the word she used, SOURCE-Y.
Wow. And for context, everybody would refer to Hubbard as source because he was the source of Scientology, right? But wow, that's crazy. So
And
she wanted David
notebook.
Miscavige's office and David Miscavige to appear as source.
Sourcey.
Which has that is the path that has transpired since we both left. That's insane.
Yeah, exactly. Before I read on, I'm going to go into this little notebook. And these notes. Here's my first page of notes. You can see it talks about English patient.
Yes, I see that.
This is probably from 1996, 1997, something like that. And for COB, no blue shirts, all white shirts. COB's office supposed to be white and khaki, and CMO Int was going to be completely different, probably blue, but take out the military, make it look like this 1930s, 1940s sort of style. Oh, there's so much in here that is just crazy, but I ended up designing some jackets for RTC. Do you remember those navy blue jackets?
Yes, I do.
Okay, so those were very 1940s. If you remember, they had epaulets up here, but not to look military. I don't remember if they did have epaulets or not, but they had kind of strong shoulders. And we had the embroidered logos, and they hit the waist. That was a very 1940s English patient style of kind of like after a bomber jacket that was worn during the war.
Yeah.
So that was the influence on the jacket, except we did it in a navy blue gabardine, and then we embroidered on it.
Yes, and didn't it have the person's name on one side and an RTC on the other? Do I remember that correctly? Okay.
Yeah, it did. And so I wanted to ask you, after I designed those RTC jackets, did you ever hear Shelley or Dave comment on that product, or like the look of it and how it fit in with their plan for transforming the look of COB's office or RTC?
Not specifically, though I know that both Dave and Shelley were both very much about appearances. You know, like there's the Hubbard policy that says they will know us by our mest, which, you know, translate that to the people in civilians in the outside world will recognize our power and our strength by the quality of our belongings and our buildings and our clothing and how we present. So they were both always very much like sharp, presentable, you know, a lot of focus on that. And I do remember the uniforms that you're talking about that were fashioned after the English patient. Of course, I had no idea that that's what they were fashioned after. But the interesting piece to me is to know that that was Shelley's direction, because in later years, it took a very sharp and different turn, which was to become all black after the police. Wow. It was intentionally patterning. And I think that was after you had escaped. And if I remember correctly, do you remember Erd Priester?
I do.
I think she is the one that did the design of the police uniforms, because of course, Religious Technology Center and David Miscavige are police. That was the intention. It's a policing organization. And in fact, I've talked about this recently, and I'm not sure if you're aware of this, but so in Scientology, any organization has an organizing board or an organizing chart. And do you remember that in the upper corner, there was a little triangular flag that represented Religious Technology Center?
I do. I
Okay,
did.
so did you know that the reason it's that shape is because it represents that RTC can go in at any level, anywhere, regardless of the command channels that everybody else is required to follow.
I did not know that. I never read that. I never heard that.
Yeah.
I
And
saw
I,
it there, but I didn't
yeah,
know
and
that.
I think it's, if I remember correctly, so of course there were RTC advices is what they were referred to, and it was a dedicated library, computer library, in the source information retrieval system referred to as SIR, and only people in Religious Technology Center had access to those. So that's why it's not something commonly known, but the point being that RTC is literally, it's also referred to as the Inspector General Network. It is entirely police. So after that English patient design that you're talking about, where Shelley was trying to look like L. Ron Hubbard, David Miscavige changed that very dramatically to police.
Fascinating. Absolutely fascinating. You remember this whole English patient thing was really also the era that LRH emerged from, 30s, 40s. He knew Leni Riefenstahl, the Nazi propagandist, in the 40s. And then somewhere not long after that, he went to Rhodesia. And in Rhodesia, he carried out this khaki pants, white shirt. There are loads of pictures of LRH with that look.
Yes.
And that is the look, or that connects to the look that Shelley was going for. How all that ties into the film, LRH's background, his thing in Rhodesia, and this whole non-military look.
Yes.
Interesting stuff.
Very much so. And of course, to tie it back, Shelley started working with Hubbard very, very closely at approximately the age of 11 in the late 60s.
Mhm.
So she probably, that's, I'm sure ties very closely to her earliest memories of him.
Yeah. And that's what he would have worn on the ship. That those are the mental, like the images she would have had of him, is that look, that khaki white ascot thing.
Yes.
And how all that to her means source. It represents source.
Yes.
It conveys the image of source. Very interesting.
Completely.
Well, I'll finish off this part of the story with, I just have to show you some of these notes. I was looking through this the other day. You just won't believe it. So here's a page right here. Can you see this? It says
Yes.
samples for RTC.
Yes.
Okay, so I have pages of these. You could look. I don't know how good of a job I'm doing to show these, but I have pages of these. Look, pages where I went out purchasing, buying samples. I have 4 pages of notes, and I log the store, the color, the cost, and I also log the payment method. Now, this goes off onto a tangent, but after I escaped in July 31st, 1998, somewhere along the line, somebody gave me some information. It might have been Peter had called his family members after I escaped to talk bad about me so that they wouldn't give me any comfort if I contacted them to let them know that I had escaped. And I think it was his brother, Bo, who said, yeah, Peter said that you committed financial irregularities. I thought, well, he was making this up. I thought he was making it up to just make me look bad. Like, oh, they got me on something, And it wasn't until recently that I actually realized this is the financial irregularities.
Wow. How so?
Because I would go purchasing. I would go to LA. I went to everywhere, to Beverly Hills, to Nordstrom, to Banana Republic, you name it. And I would buy stuff out of my pocket, no approved POs.
I see. Wow.
There were times when I did have a credit card that was given to me by somebody from RTC. I don't remember if it was Shelley. It could have been Marion Dendu. I don't remember.
Or it could also have been Barbara Griffin.
Somebody in Treasury, maybe, to do some purchasing. But this was the way that my post was. I mean, there I was after I was in the Int landlord's office, which is in the Int finance network. But really, nobody ran me. It was Shelley and Dave who gave me my marching orders, or they gave me my direction, and I would just do my job. I didn't really need somebody telling me what to do, but I just needed direction. But I would go out and, I would CSW and say, I need to go purchase samples for RTC uniform project, whatever. And I would go and I logged all this stuff right here.
Wow.
But this is financial irregularity if you look at it from a strict LRH policy, to where you write a CSW and you get it approved and you get a purchase order and it gets approved through Treasury, and then they give you the money, or they give you a way to buy it, like an approved card or something. So I have 4 pages of this.
Yeah.
And a lot of this was for the RTC samples, but some of it became personal for Dave and for Shelley. I was buying things for Dave and Shelley. So in essence, I was being their shopper.
Right.
In a
Wow.
sense. And in many cases, I mean, I would, if Shelley decided to keep something, I have notes. Here's my card. Use my card. Some is cash. And so the point is, so I was doing all that. That had to be the summer of, like, between 97 and 98. I was working on this project. So when I escaped, one of the things that I had to go over with Peter, and he and I never spoke, I had to write this in a note. And I said, look, you need to collect from RTC, because I used our credit card to buy a lot of stuff for the RTC project. So I don't know if he ever cleared that out, ever got reimbursed from RTC, but there's a big fat financial irregularity with RTC.
Wow. And of course, for context, had you said, oh, I need to go and get a purchase order approved first, like when Dave or Shelley would order you to do something, you were expected to just immediately go and get it done.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. You know that delays were not tolerated.
No.
Delays, who could delay, complying to an order from Dave? Or from Shelley.
Right. And isn't it true that if you did that, you would be found guilty of the crime of, quote, using policy to stop, unquote.
There you go. Yes. Using policy.
You're damned if you do, and you're damned if you don't.
So, wow. So I was between a rock and a hard place on that one, but Shelley kept quite a few things that I bought. I've got, on one of these pages, I've got her sizes, I've got Dave's sizes. Everything from shoes to waist to neck collar size, sleeve length, inseam, everything. So wow. Yeah, that was a pretty interesting era. Of course, I enjoyed it because that was like my work that I enjoyed doing. And I thought, wow, I guess this is okay. So anyway,
that's crazy.
Yeah. So one day, so I was asking you where Shelley's office was in the upper villa. I know where it was down the hall from COB, but there was another area that she used to work in. And I think that must have been in the middle villa. because it was sort of off the driveway and there was a room that had a work table in the middle.
So that, I know what you're talking about. That was in the Loa Villa, and it was
Okay.
on, if it's the room I'm thinking of, it was on the south side of the villa. So it looked out over the road, Highway 79 that ran through the property. So it was on the back side of the Loa Villa.
Okay, that I don't remember.
Okay.
I remember going up there on my scooter, coming up the driveway, and then going into this room with her. So she brought me into this room one day, and we were talking about the RTC uniforms. But that whole discussion segued into another conversation, and it's quite amazing. And I wrote it in detail in my book.
Good.
All right, so I figured this would be a good time to talk about this because, you know, I learned a lot about Shelley as she was talking to me about things like the English patient and her contacts with LRH on the ship, and the idea to sort of assimilate, or no, excuse me, to exemplify a source image, which I think is very interesting because most of the pictures that public have seen of LRH are from his earlier days in the 60s.
Yes.
The 60s and 70s, Rhodesia and things like that. So that image was there. So, all right. So in that context, so she brought me up to this villa, to this workroom, and it was away from COB. His workspace was nowhere near this. And she and I were sitting at a work table by ourselves, and there was a window. Anyway, no one else was around. So in the middle of talking about the English patient, 1930s look and all that, the Banana Republic thing, I'm going to read now in the from this expert in my book, page 284. In the midst of this lighthearted conversation, COB assistant asked me, "What tone level do you think the int-based staff are in?" With little hesitation, I said, "I think most everyone is numb or in fear." And I wrote, that's below 1.1 covert hostility, around 1.0 on a scale of 0 to 40. Individuals ridden by fear are afraid to be or to own anything. That's in my book. So I said, you know, I was shocked that she asked me, what tone level do you think the int-based staff are in?
Yep.
Wow. That was actually quite a personal question.
Very definitely. Yeah. And do you think that she was asking you that with the inference that that tone level was driven by David Miscavige or something else?
Oh, I'll read you the rest.
Oh, okay.
I
Sorry, not
that.
to jump ahead.
No. Good question, because that's exactly what I talk about. Okay, so I said, well, you know, she said, what tone level do you think the int-based staff are in? And I said, I think most everyone is numb or in fear. Okay, so that's around 1 to 1.0. COB assistant responded, I think they're lower, like in apathy. And for those who aren't familiar with the tone scale, apathy is very low on the tone scale, which I think is like 0.5, somewhere around there.
Yes, that's right, which is essentially half a point above being dead.
Above
complete
dead.
apathy, like it's depicted in the Scientology film as just like, you know, very close to dead. Yeah.
Yes. So COB assistant responded, I think they're lower, like in apathy. And I go on to say, I wanted to ask her why she thought the staff had fallen into apathy, but I felt a bit cautious of treading too far into what was, or what had been, a comfortable conversation. I did say, I think many people don't know how to do what's wanted on their post. They're afraid of screwing up and angering COB. And Shelley replied, So many people have no clue how to do work without requiring orders. They wait for orders before they will do anything. And I looked at Shelley and I said, I thought to myself, God, I'm having this conversation with COB assistant, right?
Yep.
About the whole int base. So I responded, sir, do you think they wait for orders to do anything because they are in fear of doing something on their own that might be wrong? She said, no, that's just being a robot. Not doing anything is apathy. Well, that was our conversation, and I have a few things to say about that.
Yeah.
And I'll read. LRH Tech on SPs and potential trouble sources says that a sign of an SP in the area is that people around them are not doing well, are sick and failing in life. I wanted to ask Shelly Miscavige whether she had ever considered getting the int-based staff through the PTSSP course. That was one thing that had never been tried in terms of correcting what seemed to be the impossible situation of uncorrectable int-based staff. But I didn't feel free to ask her that question, nor was Shelly Miscavige free enough in her own thinking to consider that her husband might be an SP, causing many staff to stumble in their effectiveness. After reflecting on that conversation and after the staff meeting that night, and I wrote about the staff meeting at CMOint that night, I concluded that this base was a sorry mess of PTSness that would never resolve using Scientology because no one could see the SP who was causing the real problems.
Wow. Interesting. So let me add some context to that of my experiences. In 1997 and 1998, Shelley was working desperately to try and get David Miscavige in session for Scientology counseling.
Oh, wow.
And she expressed that she was concerned he'd had a psychotic break.
Did you see evidence of this yourself?
Well, I mean,
and obviously the way he behaved was just psychotic. But
yes,
what I meant to say was there a moment that she might have been referring to, or was this a general behavioral situation?
It was a general behavioral situation for sure. But she was absolutely very concerned.
Wow.
Yeah.
Could you repeat what you said? You said that she was, say it again, please.
Yeah. So Shelley was working very hard to get David Miscavige into session, like for Scientology counseling, to address what she felt was he was heading for or had a psychotic break.
Wow. And this was 97?
97 and early 1998. So at the time, the factors that were going on that I understood were contributing to this concern that she had, because she had brought it up, is that the Lisa McPherson legal proceedings, both the criminal and civil, were ongoing.
Mm-hmm.
And David Miscavige knew that to be a huge threat, or stated it many times that it was a huge threat to Scientology, and the entire burden of fixing that situation legally was on him completely.
Wow. I mean, I'm aware that that happened, and I'm aware that he would have thought that way, but I was unaware that she was questioning whether he had had a psychotic break.
Yes.
And that is so fascinating to me, because this moment when she, brought me into this workroom and had this conversation with me, I mean, who was I? Maybe she considered me, and I do believe she considered me, I wouldn't say friend, but because people at the int base, especially between RTC and lower staff, didn't necessarily make friends or
No.
act like friends with people like that. But
Yeah.
I think that there were exceptions in terms of you knew who you felt you could trust, and you knew who you felt you could maybe even confide in, you know. I mean, it takes trust to confide, but for her to ask me questions like, what tone level do you think the int-based staff are in? I thought was absolutely fascinating that she asked me that question.
Absolutely. She obviously was maybe not considering you a peer per se, because I completely agree with your statement about friendships, and I've said the same thing. Like you and I, as an example, worked together at that property for 10 years approximately, let's say. And
Yes.
yet we've talked more in these 2 interviews than we ever did in 10 years that we were there. I'm just saying,
So
for
true.
context, it's completely true. There's no such thing as friends in the
Yeah.
Sea organization. And even the people that I confided in when I was in Religious Technology Center promptly turned around and stabbed me in the back, to the point that I was like, wow, I'm never doing that ever again.
Yeah. I'm never trusting anybody with my thoughts, my
Yes.
emotions, my fears.
Yes.
You can't, because
No.
it's a reporting environment.
Yes.
So
Snitch culture is
yes,
very,
snitch
very
culture.
alive and well in the Sea organization. But yeah, so even Shelley, for the 4 years that I was internal executive, where I was my direct senior was Marty Rathbun. He was my boss, and
Oh,
so
wow.
that's where, according to the Scientology lawyers in our lawsuit and in my deposition, they were like, well, isn't it true you were number 3 in command? And so, yes, technically, if you were looking at the Religious Technology Center org chart that we were talking about, yes, I was number 3. Did that mean I had freedoms and, ability to, maybe a little bit, but no, I was a prisoner just as everybody else was.
Wow. Especially under Marty Rathbun.
Yes,
Wow.
completely.
Wow.
Anyway, but yeah, so Shelley, I agree with you. I looked up to her. I considered her a mentor. I considered her an empathetic, compassionate person who believed deeply in L. Ron Hubbard and the mission. But in retrospect and in doing the series, I question, well, is that because she got in when she was 6 years old, or is that because she still actually believes that to this day? And I honestly don't know the answer to that.
Yeah. And we will never know. I mean, highly unlikely that we will ever have that conversation.
Yes.
But boy, would I love to be a fly on the wall. I would love to talk with her now about what we went through then. And what you told me just now, you told us just now about 1997, 1998, her thinking, needing to get him in session because she was concerned that he may have had a psychotic break, says everything about her.
Yes.
I mean, that is very telling, because, wow, that ties into the whole Simon Bolivar thing.
Yes. The responsibility of leaders, which is
a
pivotal policy that Shelley, that was her playbook on everything. I mean, the amount of times you probably even had to word clear, read that policy out loud, all 10 pages of it.
That might have been what you sent me to cramming on. Maybe on that HCOB or whatever it was, HCOB
policy. Yes.
Yeah, it very well could be. But you're right. She demonstrated that to the essence. I mean, that was the essence of her role as COB assistant, responsibility of leaders. But at the same time, you got to wonder, she was his wife. And yes, she was COB assistant. But as a wife, if your husband's like going crazy or off the rails, and with his erratic behavior and his violent outbursts, she had to be concerned about his well-being.
Oh,
And,
yes.
I mean, even separate from her post as COB assistant, she was his wife. And so she saw how it was affecting him in ways that nobody else would have been able to observe.
Yes, completely. And there's no doubt, you remind me too, Shelley absolutely saw the cracks forming, not only in his physical and emotional and violent outbursts, but also on many occasions, I had to interrogate female staff that Shelley suspected, that they were up to no good with, or had, intentions to engage with David Miscavige.
Like flirt with him or
Yep.
be seductive some way in their behavior.
Yes.
I wondered
Jenny
about that.
Linson was one of those.
I'm sure she was.
Yep.
I had those questions myself about Jenny. No
Right.
question.
Yeah,
No
because
question.
Jenny was in David Miscavige's inner circle
Yeah.
for many, many years.
Yeah.
Yeah. Anyway, not to get
That-
off topic, but Shelley
Well-
definitely saw the cracks forming.
I'm sure she did. And interesting you bring that up because that was one of my questions that I was going to ask you. But, did related to that. But I won't go off on that tangent.
Okay.
But I want to finish. So we're talking about David's state of mind and how Shelley reacted to this. It was her as her own person being his wife, but it was also her and her role of COB assistant and how she used the responsibility of leader Simon Bolivar policy as her playbook. But this is what she had to deal with. I tried to describe his behavior, and this is I wrote this in my IMPR chapter, but this is all in context of Shelley having to deal with this. Okay.
Yeah.
It's on page 256 in my book, and it says clearly David Miscavige had his own ways of addressing problems and conflicts, and his state of mind seemed to be outside of our experiences. We were always expected to refer to a policy or some Scientology tech that would help to handle a problem. Miscavige didn't lead with Scientology like that. He always talked and even screamed about Scientology and getting ethics and tech in. He talked the talk that he didn't walk. DM lived in a different world than the rest of us as Scientologists. He became an enigma to me. It was hard to comprehend who he really was. One thing I knew for sure, Dave held a strange advantage over the rest of us who had consciences that kept us in line. He seemed to behave with unhampered liberty to do just as he pleased. He made himself out to be flawless and overworked because of us. I wondered if he ever had a pang of conscience after he verbally or physically abused one of his staff. I began to question whether he had a conscience at all. He seemed to have ice water in his veins. He didn't seem to exercise any restraints on himself when it came to expressing frustration or anger. He would scream in someone's face, push or hit them, and then walk away and start a new conversation as if nothing had just happened. I never once saw anyone confront him about his abusive behavior and case dramatizations. Perhaps the real problem at the Int base was not that everyone who worked here was so incompetent or suppressive, as Miscavige said. Perhaps the problem was that David Miscavige possessed the ability to conceal his true psychological makeup that we couldn't understand. Did he even believe in Scientology or L. Ron Hubbard anymore? I often wondered. David Miscavige was far from my role model for an on-source Scientologist, but it would work to his benefit that who he really was would remain invisible to the rest of us. This would enable him to continue exercising a strange advantage over our handicapped minds.
Wow, that is powerful, Karen. And you're absolutely right. We had handicapped minds completely.
And I'm bringing this up right now because this is the mind that Shelley was married to And this is what she had to deal with on a routine basis. And, I wasn't there in her last days when, and I don't remember if you had left at this point, but when she exercised an independent executive decision and finished up the org boards that pissed him off, and that preceded her being escorted off the base in a car and disappeared forever. Okay, so she exercised that independent decision knowing that she was dealing with this mind that I just described.
Yes.
And she got the whammy right there. She got it. She got the full brunt of it
Yes.
right
And
there.
yes. And so her final days as his assistant were after I left. I think she was, it was probably about 6 months after I escaped. So I escaped in January 2005.
Okay.
But honestly, I believe that that piece of what you were just talking about in terms of the org board, and so she was finishing the org chart that had been supposed to be being completed. By that point, it was already direct orders from David Miscavige from 1999. So this was now 2005. So 6 years, and the org charts had not been completed. And because the org charts had not been completed, David Miscavige said by that time, nobody had a post, because you can't have a post if the org chart isn't approved. It became this just this big giant
chaos.
Exactly. But my point being that, yes, I believe that this incident was a major piece, but I also believe that Shelly Miscavige violently disagreed with how much David Miscavige was interacting with Tom Cruise by that point.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that played a role in her being disappeared out of his life.
And that was around 2005.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, that's 7 years after I was gone. And you said 6 months after you were gone.
Yes.
Wow. So yeah, I can't speak to any of that. But even though I left in 98, I had garnered all these thoughts and all these views. And thank God I captured them and put them in a book, because it's still true today as it was when I wrote it.
Completely.
I published it in 2017, although I'd been writing it for years prior. But crazy. So, which ties back to what we were talking about in part 1, this conflict of the hard is cold chrome steel thing. Because that is what triggered my questioning of who Shelley was when I saw her observe Dave being abusive, whether it was physical assault or verbal abuse or exercising humiliation on people, things like that. And I think that this really grated her at her core. And you made a comment in our first talk about how you sometimes struggled with being hard as cold chrome steel. So I wanted to ask you a question, if you'll allow me to ask you this question.
Absolutely.
Because it relates to you and Shelley and this topic. So when you were in RTC, were the staff drilled or indoctrinated or educated in any way, shape, or form about how to be as hard as cold chrome steel?
That is a great question. And yes. So for example, do you remember the movie No Way Out with Kevin Costner?
Probably.
Okay.
Refresh my memory.
So I'm going to botch it because I'm really terrible, even though I saw the movie like 4 times. Essentially, he is a spy, and he's sent in at a young age. He's like a sleeper agent. And anyway, he ends up being in the military, and it's this whole big thing, and you don't know who the spy is from the beginning, but it's a shocker of a revelation when you find out, oh my gosh, he was a spy. Anyway, And it's not that that was representing hard as cold chrome steel. I think it just represents the paranoia that was in David Miscavige's mind. And there was another movie, oh gosh, Mark would remember, with I'm going to have to look it up and we'll talk about it next time. But you mentioned Art Series 8 and how, for example, you had to watch The English Patient as to pattern your uniform design. Well, RTC, Religious Technology Center, was made to watch No Way Out as an example of like
interesting.
Yeah. And because it was always Shelley and David Miscavige both were always completely paranoid of plants, what they were. And I don't actually honestly know if that's generally a real world term or just unique to Scientology in terms of the context. But a plant being somebody that's been sent in to destroy Scientology and is reporting to the outside or the police or the FBI, they were always suspicious of people being plants.
Wow.
And yeah. And the whole
as was LRH.
Yes.
Look at how he implemented all the policy at the in-base of like, we couldn't use scented products or scented laundry detergent or soaps because this could be covering up some sort of poison or something that a plant had implemented that would harm him or anybody else that was there.
Yes, exactly. So in the late 90s, Religious Technology Center started doing plant checks on people just randomly. Like David Miscavige would say, that person's a plant check them. And of course, in the Hubbard writings about plants, it involves that there's use of pain, drug, and hypnosis to flip somebody to become a plant to do to carry out the evil mission or whatever.
Right.
But there was so much suspicion of that. And yes, absolutely. To get back to your question in terms of hard as cold chrome steel, there was always like this, just this requirement to have that steel edge. Another example of that is in 1996, when I was sent to Clearwater, Florida, I was in a group of, I think, approximately 26 other Religious Technology Center staff who were training to become representatives.
RTC
who were going,
reps.
Yes,
I remember. Yeah.
Yes. And we were going to be sent to all organizations all over the world as David Miscavige's eyes and ears on the ground to be able to report to him anything and everything that was of Religious Technology Center concern, which, there's a giant long list, and it includes any Scientologist reporting to the police, for example, any legal matters that would affect Scientology, on and on and on. Ironically, I was supposed to be the RTC rep for Celebrity Center.
Wow.
I don't know if you knew that.
I did not.
Yeah, but the point being, to get back to the question, one of the requirements to graduate from this representative training program was you had to send somebody to the Rehabilitation Project Force.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. So you had to be a hard ass, hard nose, cold police.
Yep.
To send somebody to Scientology's prison camp, essentially.
Right. Yeah.
You couldn't falter.
No, you had to, stick to it, and you weren't going to make it through the program if you didn't do that requirement.
Wow, that's crazy. So your description of this. So when I asked you, about the training. So okay, I see now how you were oriented to this mindset of being hard as cold chrome steel, and you commented in our first talk. You said that you sometimes were struggled with it or were challenged by it. What did you mean by that?
So, yeah, that's a really great question. I think that, there's so many elements in my upbringing in Scientology that seemed contrary to being hard as cold chrome steel. And as from my perspective, there beingness, doingness, havingness was a core concept in Scientology. If you're in the right beingness, being who you're supposed to, whatever role you're supposed to play, that you establish what it is you're supposed to be, then what it is you're supposed to do to then accomplish the havingness or your product, right? As if you're, it's a core management concept in Scientology, policy concept in Scientology. And so always it would be, you establish your beingness, then you outline what it is you have to do to get your product, and then you do it. And to have a beingness that emulated metal, we're human beings, like how it just seemed to be in complete conflict with so many core concepts of Scientology that I was really trying to, contort my mind to adhere to. Like,
Yeah.
how can you be hard as cold chrome steel and yet have affinity, a feeling of love or liking, reality, something you can agree upon, communication, understanding? How can you have, like, they just seemed to be contradictory. And
Absolutely.
and then factor in, okay, you're, as a counselor in Scientology, another core concept is you're supposed to have the person, if I'm the auditor and you're the pre-clear or the recipient, or on the receiving end, you're supposed to be interested in your own case and willing to talk to me. And if I'm hard as cold chrome steel, how does that work? Again, it just seemed at every turn to be contradictory, and I struggled with it because I didn't, my purpose, I thought that I was doing something that was going to help people. And when it turned into David Miscavige screaming that this person has X, Y, and Z going on, I really struggled with that, because I'm like, well, how do you know that that's what they have going on? How do you know? And how can you assume that that's what they've got going on? And how, it all just was at great odds, just conflicting. And I didn't have a resolution to it.
That's an amazing, amazing example that points to the question about David Miscavige and his, I think that being paranoid was in his DNA.
Yeah.
Because he got it from LRH. How else would he have learned that? I mean, when he was at St. Hill, when Ron had brought the family to St. Hill, he was supposed to learn to audit. So where did he get that from? It certainly wasn't in his family's DNA. So he gets to work with LRH at W as a cameraman. And of course, he learns that LRH is paranoid, and he lives in such a way as to be Fabian, and always knowing that the FBI is going to be coming after him, or whatever was in his mind for the paranoia. So Dave learned this, and then he began to live it, because then they started all this crazy stuff of driving back and forth to wherever LRH was hiding. And, so it became part of his mindset. It was part of his computations. And like I wrote in my book, he lived in a different world than the rest of us.
Yes,
Because
completely.
and so did Shelley. And Shelley, growing up on the ship, of course, she would have picked some of that up from LRH, because he was on the ship, because he was avoiding the IRS and the FBI.
Right.
That doesn't mean that he told them the truth about why he was on the ship. She just saw the lifestyle that he was living. But the point being, wow, that paranoia is what caused all of that.
Yes, completely. And so, not to cut you off, but we're well past our hour. Do you think we'll need to should we plan on a part 3 of Where's Shelley, or do you feel that the next part should just be more general?
Well, I think that we've talked about so many things that if it turns out that the viewers, that your audience are very interested in all this, then I would love to continue to pick up on this thread. And it might not focus only on Shelley, but I think that Shelley would be like the trigger for talking about many topics, because I have 13 questions on my sheet of paper to ask you. Here's all
That's
these
amazing.
questions.
That's amazing.
And
Well,
they all came up from this conversation. There's something that I'm dying to ask you.
well, go ahead. Go
Can
ahead.
I ask
yes.
you one question, and then we can end, and then we can decide to continue. Okay.
Perfect.
All right. So earlier you were talking about Shelley and RTC, the hardest cold chrome steel thing. We've talked about that, but we were talking about how RTC did not necessarily mingle with people in lower orgs, even though it was CMO in finance, exec strata to gold, like different orgs on the base. So basically, it was RTC people befriending each other. Although, as you and I have said, there was no time to strike up a friendship, right?
Right. Yep.
So one thing that I observed, and I've been dying to ask you this question, because there was this distinct separation between RTC and the rest of the in-base orgs. There was a time, and I wanted to know if Shelley was part of this evolution or if it was just Dave, but there was a time when RTC staff were physically kind of relocated to where RTC staff were only going on one bus, where RTC staff lived in off-base apartments together for those who lived off-base, which for the most part was everybody to my knowledge.
Yeah.
There might have been a few people that lived on base or down the road in those little cottages. But we lived, at the Devonshire. We lived at the one closer to Hemet where I lived. We lived in different complexes, but RTC staff at a point were just put out on their own, like living in apartments with only RTC staff, busing with only RTC staff. Now we all use the same dining hall. And of course you had your own offices. But what I wanted to know is, what was the thinking, the mindset behind that? Because it's and I wanted to know if Shelley is this something that she implemented as a COB order, or was it her idea, or how did this come about, and what was the mindset behind it?
Yes, great question. This was completely driven by David Miscavige, and again ties back to his paranoia. Let's see. So Mark and I were married in 1992, and then I was promoted into Religious Technology Center in 1996. Our entire 13 years of marriage at that property, David Miscavige went after us, trying to destroy our relationship, specifically and pointedly, but even more so after I became a member of Religious Technology Center. And specifically, I had a conversation with David Miscavige in 2000 in the Middle Villa, where he said, I'm implementing a new personnel policy for RTC. And I said, yes, sir, I heard, because Shelley had told me ahead of this conversation. And he said, what is it? And I said, you're going to require that any member of Religious Technology Center cannot be married to anybody else not in Religious Technology Center. Wow. And of course, he knew.
She told you that. She told you that was going to be implemented. Okay?
Yes. And the reason why is because it kept coming up. That staff of Religious Technology Center would share things that David Miscavige said only to Religious Technology Center, and that was considered out security and sleeping with the enemy. These are the words, the terms that David Miscavige used to describe this, and essentially was threatening him. Because, like, for example, I'm not sure if you remember Sporey and Caroline Sporey. Caroline was a staff member in Religious Technology Center, and she said something to about something she witnessed David Miscavige do or say or something, and that was nattering about David Miscavige, saying a critical thing, even though she was just saying what happened. So essentially, this was viewed as this isolation of Religious Technology Center was to completely make them assume the hard as cold chrome steel physically by isolation and having no interaction with anybody not in Religious Technology Center. So that the goal being that they would unquestioningly and unwaveringly execute and do whatever David Miscavige said to do.
Wow. Wow. So that was the whole reasoning behind the separate buses, the separation in apartments. Wow.
Yep, it was for David Miscavige's security so that nobody would know what he was doing behind closed doors, and that, rumors wouldn't be spread about him. It was completely his paranoia.
Wow. That
Yeah.
makes total sense.
Yeah.
Wow. That's crazy. Wow. Well, we could go on and on, because that leads to more thoughts and questions and more stories.
Yes. Well, we'll schedule a part 3, but to conclude this one, I have one question for you. You ready?
Okay.
Okay. If you could talk to Shelley today, what would you tell her?
Wow. I would probably say that I could see who she really was when I got to know her, in moments when she stole away to just be herself. And first of all, I would thank her for helping me in those bad times. But if she was in a position where she was entrapped, and she felt that she had to stay where she was, I would tell her that I would say, Shelley, you're such a strong woman. And no matter how you've been convinced that you don't deserve another life or you don't deserve better, you do. You have so much to give the world. And I would do anything I could to help you start a new life.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Karen. I'm just so grateful for your time today in talking about this, and we will very definitely do part 3, in which you can ask me as many questions as you'd like, and we can compare notes on many other mutual experiences. How does that sound?
That sounds fabulous. I would love to do that. And may I ask the audience a question?
Yes, go for it.
Okay. In the comments, I just really appreciate the comments after our part 1. In the comments, I would love to know, because Claire and I are obviously, we're really good communicating with each other. And I think we have so much to share that could help other people. I'm just curious if anyone wants to comment. Would they like to hear about additional topics? And if so, if you don't want to say what those topics are, would you be interested in hearing about things like how we got in trouble and what was the cause of it and how we dealt with it? And these are things that might shock people. Would that be an interesting topic? I'd love to hear that. I'd love to hear that in the comments.
Amazing. So to everyone tuning in here today, drop us a comment below and answer Karen's question and let us know your thoughts. We will look forward to reading those. And thank you again, Karen. I will talk to you very soon. Until next time. Bye-bye.
Claire, thank you so much. Until next time.
Alrighty.
Bye.